Hey, it's Ryan Thomas Dalton. Thank you for watching. I've wanted to make this video for a while. This is a look at the now years old a7S II. A lot of people ask me if this camera is still worth buying, and I just wanted to briefly go into my response to that question. The a7S II has been out, like I said, for years. Now you can get it at quite a discounted rate, but since then, cameras like the a7 III have come out, or the Fuji X-T3, a lot of great cameras. So what about the a7S II? Is it still worth buying at a discounted rate, maybe used on eBay, where I like to buy a lot of my stuff? Let's take a look at some of the things I like and don't like about the a7S II. Let's start with some of the arguments against this camera. One, like I said, lots of new cameras are out, from the a7R III to the a7 III. The a7 III maybe being one of the biggest arguments against this camera, seeing that the a7 III is now Sony's entry-level full-frame camera. It's got great autofocus, which the a7S II does not have. It also does not crop in slow motion. The a7S II does crop in slow motion. Similarly, though, the codecs. You're shooting still at an 8-bit codec, and a lot of people think, well, I can't color grade that too much. I don't want the color grading to fall apart. But I will say this, you can color grade it. You've got the options of S-Log, which I actually don't use. I prefer the Cine 4. If you know anything about Sony's picture profiles, that sort of thing, Cine 4 is kind of a middle ground between a flat log profile and kind of just a normal picture profile, and I love Cine 4. I don't get a lot of noise with it, but I can still color grade it, and as long as you don't go super heavy on it, you can get a good grade on this camera too. So with that out of the way, what do I think of the rest of the camera? I mentioned the autofocus. The autofocus isn't great. It is existent, though. It's better than, say, Blackmagic's autofocus or another filmmaking camera kind of that caliber, but not as good as the a7 III or some of the newer APS-C cameras like the X-T3 from Fujifilm. But the autofocus is there. A lot of times when you're filmmaking, you're not going to use the autofocus. I kind of switch. I'm maybe half and half. What I'll do is I'll use manual focus a lot of the time, but then when I do want autofocus, I'll kind of use just a 1 point, kind of a half click on the shutter button, focus the scene the way I want it, and then kind of shoot it from there. But if you're looking for a camera that's just great continuous autofocus, the a7S II probably isn't that camera. All that being said, those are probably the two biggest negatives, the 8-bit codec and mediocre autofocus. There are things I love about this camera, and that's the reason I still have this camera. One of the great things about any Sony, in my opinion, from the a6000 to the Sony a7, which I made a video about, you can watch that, is the ability to use almost any lens. On the a7S II, I shot a wedding film for my buddy with Nikon lenses. I made a video recently about an old Russian or Ukrainian lens, I'm not sure which. You can look that up, but I threw that on here with a $12, $13 adapter. Same with the Nikon. I used a Nikon that had manual aperture and used it all in manual, and used, again, a $10 to $12 adapter for that. I've used Canon FD lenses. Those are some of my favorite vintage lenses. I've got the FD 28mm, the 50mm, the 85. I've used all those. You can adapt just about any lens with a super cheap adapter and you're good to go. That is not the case, as I found out, with Canon EF or EOS cameras. I've had some issues with those. That's not a knock to Canon, but you just can't adapt a ton of lenses like you can with the Sony. That being said, I love the look of so many lenses on this camera. I'll show you a few examples. Here's a clip from that Ukrainian-Russian lens. I made a whole video about the lens itself, but this was shot at 120 frames a second with the Sony a7S II. You can see it looks pretty cool. I don't know if you may not like the color grading or the lens itself, but you can see that you can do cool things with vintage lenses and foreign lenses and all sorts of stuff. And we'll take a look at another clip. This is for a trainer. I made a promotional video for his training services, and I used two lenses. I used the native Sony FE 50mm, which had autofocus, albeit not the greatest autofocus. And I also, for the shots of the woman working out, I used the Canon FD 50mm. No reason why, really. I just wanted to try both 50mm and kind of compare them. But I used the FD, of course, fully manual, and I like that too. I enjoyed this whole shoot with the Sony a7S II. Now, the greatest thing about this camera, in my opinion, and kind of the feature that ruined a lot of other cameras for me, is, of course, that high ISO performance. It is crazy. A lot has been said about it from the very beginning. Somebody made a short film with the a7S II using only moonlight because you can. And there's hundreds, probably thousands and millions of videos about the low light performance of this camera, but it is the superpower of the a7S II, and probably the reason ultimately why I've kept this camera for so long. The footage is great, the 4K is great. I don't mind the crop on slow motion, but ultimately it's the low light performance is crazy. Yeah, as a cinematographer, you always want to light your scenes. You just use a light, it'll look better. I have lights in here. However, if you're shooting weddings, if you're shooting documentary style stuff, or just some run and gun filmmaking, the ability to shoot in low light with minimal or no grain is incredible. I cannot say enough. It is the superpower of this camera. Real quick about the crop in on the slow-mo. What's interesting is I've learned to work with it, as you often do, with whatever tool you have, whether you're forced to just shoot on your smartphone or you just have some old camera or whatever it is, you work within your limits, and sometimes that fosters creativity. For me, with the crop on the slow motion, what I'm saying is when you switch into slow motion, 120 frames a second, it crops in. So suddenly your wide lens is not as wide. Your 50 millimeter is a lot further zoomed in and a lot tighter of a shot. How you can use that creatively with this camera is when you're switching between, say, 24 frames a second or 60 frames a second, which is also slow motion, and 120 when it starts to crop, you basically get two lenses. So if you're using, say, like a 28 millimeter lens, you've got a wide shot at 60 frames a second, got some slow motion there. You switch to 120, it crops in. Now you're kind of shooting at a different prime lens length, like a 50 millimeter or something. And you start to realize that you can kind of use two different lenses with the crop. At least that's what I've done with the crop factor of the 120 frames a second slow motion. While this camera is primarily known as a filmmaking camera, let's not forget about the photography. A lot of people overlook this camera because it's only 12 megapixels. However, it's not just the megapixels that go into a great camera. Of course, it's the ISO performance, it's the full frame of the a7S II, and of course the light gathering abilities of those 12 megapixels. I've used this camera, the a7S II, for countless professional gigs, from weddings to photo shoots, all sorts of things. I've used it for photography or just for fun. It's great for nighttime photography. It's great for astrophotography, and it mustn't be overlooked. 12 megapixels, you say, that's not big enough. Well, I promise you, I've made prints all the way up to 70 inches. This one here is a 70-inch print, so nearly 6 feet, and it worked out just fine. So ultimately, is the Sony a7S II still worth it? I say it is. This is just my opinion, but there are very few cameras that can really give you clean 4K, clean 1080 in such low light. It truly is incredible, and the ability to just shoot stuff where other people can't shoot or other cameras can't shoot is incredible. So many times I've been with friends and the light just wasn't good enough for them to shoot. However, with the a7S II, it's kind of like not a problem. That does kind of ruin other cameras for you if you're used to the superpower low light of the a7S II and you grab another camera. I won't bash any cameras in particular, but you switch to another camera, even great cameras, cinema cameras, which are notorious eaters of light. They need lots of light. Boy, is it frustrating after using the a7S II. So if you can find one for a great price, just the body, if you've got any lenses, you can adapt them to the a7S II. So just the body, get a steal on it, and it is totally worth it. Shoots great 4K, shoots great slow motion, and because of the law of diminishing returns, like cameras are only getting incrementally better over the years. So even though the a7S II is years old, it's still a great camera with great footage, great features, a menu system that takes some getting used to, but that superpower low light is incredible. It will get you through so many situations, whether, like I said, you're a wedding filmmaker or a documentary filmmaker, or just love the run and gun and don't want to carry a whole bunch of lights with you. This camera is outstanding. For those who like to see stuff that's been shot, yes, it's been used in TV shows and movies. You can look that up. It's a great little camera. So in spite of an 8-bit codec, it has been used on bigger productions. And in spite of being years old, it's still a great camera. In spite of mediocre autofocus, still an awesome camera. Maybe not your next vlog camera, but if you get one at a steal, like I said, and you're a filmmaker of any kind, I don't think you'll be disappointed with this camera. So thumbs up for that. Thanks for watching the video. Please subscribe, like the video, share it with some friends, and I'll be back soon. This is Ryan saying thanks for watching. I'll see you.